Hi, I'm Quatsi, and this is Macretia, and we are your woke and wealthy coaches. This is episode 4, and we're excited to continue our conversation with you today. On our last episode, we talked about some of the implications and consequences of the 2020 U.S. general election, where President elect Joe Biden and Vice President elect Kamala Harris were elected and confirmed as the incoming president and vice president of the United States. And last time we started peeling back the layers of the onion of President elect Joe Biden's plan for Black America. He calls it Lift Every Voice. You can find that plan at joebiden.com/Black America. We encouraged you last time to read it. It has several major bullet points. We looked at the first bullet point last time concerning advancing or increasing the economic mobility of African Americans. Now, we're going to continue to decompose that plan and look at other elements. And, we're going to conclude that discussion today. But the overall context of this discussion is, again, understanding the rules of the game. Ultimately, our channel, our podcast, it's about wealth building in a social justice, social consciousness framework and environment. And when we talk about wealth, we're talking about whole life wealth, money, social justice, health, and other aspects. And so, with the incoming new administration, you have several new senators, several new congressmen and women coming in, as well as a new president and vice president. This is a time when the rules of the game always change. Sometimes they change a lot, sometimes they change a little. We can expect some significant changes, or at least a lot of significant discussion around the rules of the game. We have a Republican president that is being replaced by a Democratic president. That's going to create a major policy shift. Several of the positions that are appointed in the government by the president will be shifting significantly. We have had, during the Trump administration, a significant shift in the balance of power between conservative and liberal on the Supreme Court. Trump has had the opportunity to select a few conservative judges to the court, and that has shifted the balance of power of the court to more conservative.
As well as federal courts, too, as well.
As well as federal courts. In fact, I was reading in an article, it's a great point, I was reading an article the other day, President Trump has made a few hundred appointments to federal courts. We don't talk about those a lot, but those are the courts that decide a lot of criminal cases, a lot of suits involving finances, involving corporate conduct. He's appointed several judges, a couple hundred judges, and these are lifetime appointments. And so
across the United States,
across
to
the
serve
United States.
districts across the United States. So that's very interesting. So we look at the Supreme Court. We look at the Supreme Court as the high court or the higher court. But if you and I were to go to trial, we're not going to see a Supreme Court justice. Some people will see, though, the federal court justices.
Exactly, exactly. And so we also have now the House of Representatives is still controlled by the Democratic Party
By hair.
by a hair, greatly reduced majority, and the Senate is still controlled by the Republican Party.
Although we're waiting on the results of the election, I think they're currently still in the election in Georgia. We're waiting on the
Mm-hmm.
results to see where we end up in the Senate. Once again, Georgia is very important in deciding the outcome of the U.S. Senate, just as it was with the United States presidency
Mm-hmm.
election.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, the whole context of the conversation today is understanding the new rules of the game, and so let's get into it. Let's continue with our discussion of Biden's plan for Black America.
Okay. Well, let me remind everyone who's listening today to go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button. If you like the content here, we would definitely appreciate you subscribing to the broadcast and to our channel uh, to help us get our message out because we think it is a relevant message and a
Mm-hmm.
message that is worthy to be shared.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I will say, Kwatsi, we explained last time that these are campaign promises.
Mm-hmm.
These are goals that the Biden Harris ticket set out so that they could get the support of Black America.
Mm-hmm.
So these are not laws, these are just goals that they shared. So anytime that you have campaign promises or goals, you must recognize that none of this is legislation.
That's right.
It has to be legislated. Many of these goals depend on the states. Some of them will also depend on a decision federally,
Mm-hmm.
but they are simply goals. But I think they're important because they determine what comes to the floor for conversation.
Exactly.
So, this agenda, much of the data that we see in this agenda may come to the House floor, to the Senate floor for debate, right? And so it's important for us to know what the strategic outlook or
Mm-hmm.
plan for Black America was for this ticket. Will it change? Yeah, it's likely to change. They're likely to add and take away, refine as refinement is taking place.
Mm-hmm.
But reading this can only just make you more aware to be socially and politically conscious of what is going on with Black America. Some of which will you will identify with, some you will not,
Mm-hmm.
depending on what zip code you live in
That's
and
right.
things of that nature. Some of this may not affect you, your household, or your children.
Right.
But it's important to understand what is here. We are not a monolith. Black
Mm-hmm.
America, many of us are wealthy, many of us are middle class, many of us are, really struggling, but there's, I don't know, we're not all in one category.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of this is affecting disparities
Mm-hmm.
and trying to really pull up those who are suffering and those who are challenged. So much of what is in this plan affects that category, although there are many elements in this plan for those who are attending college or those who are in the teaching field. There's things in this plan to help and aid those persons as well.
Yeah.
Okay? So one of the things I think education was one of the highlights that
Yep.
where we left off.
Yep. And I'll read that. And as you said, Mercretia, and this is powerful. The good news is that President-elect Biden, has a plan. He has an agenda. Because of course, if you don't have a set of goals, if you don't have an agenda, you know, what's that scripture in the book of Qatsi, verse 1, chapter 1? Blessed is the man that aimeth at nothing, for he shall surely hit it.
Mm,
Right? So it's good
mm-hmm.
that there is a plan, that there's an agenda. But we're going to talk about the implications. We're going to talk about some of the barriers, some of the obstacles to implementing this. Now, the second major topic that was here in this plan, we talked about economic mobility last time. And here, the second major bullet says expand access to high quality education and tackle racial inequity in our education system. And so, major bullets under that are provide high quality universal pre kindergarten and for all 3 and 4 year olds, eliminate funding gap between white and non-white districts and rich and poor districts in order to give teachers a raise, expand STEM curriculum in underserved schools, improve teacher diversity, reinstate the Obama-Biden administration's actions to diversify our schools, ensure African Americans are not inappropriately identified as having disabilities, address the African American student debt crisis, and increase college completion by making college affordable for African Americans. And there are some other major elements, but these are sort of the key points of Biden's plan for education as it pertains to Black America.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Kwasi. I think it's important for us to remind ourselves. We often like to go back in history and look around a topic to see what has been hovering over a period of time. And I'd like to remind you that in 1954, that was when Brown versus the Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And so we know that Plessy versus Ferguson was about separate but equal. The idea being, as long as we have separate accommodations for blacks and for whites, and those accommodations are fairly equal, there is no need to integrate the schools. We recognize that Brown versus Board of Education was able to highlight in many instances across America overwhelmingly where we did not have equal facilities, equal skills and ability to teach and train our children. And therefore, that led to Brown versus Board of Education getting passed in 1954. And this was happening. This was around the time of, we know this time to be very instrumental in the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, where the civil rights movement was gaining momentum. And so, with that, I want to bring to the table a little girl named Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was a child whose parents, they moved from Mississippi to New Orleans, and she was the first child that was recorded to have gone to an integrated school. Ruby had to be taken to school by U.S. Marshals and federal agents because the climate in New Orleans, around Southern America, and maybe other parts of America
Yeah.
as well, were very resistant to what I'm going to refer as the B&B change. This was a change that was decided at the federal level by passing Brown versus Board of Education. This law was passed, but the country was not ready to handle this change. What would you say about that, Kwatsi?
Well, oftentimes legislation leads cultural acceptance, especially as it pertains to social change, and especially as it pertains to racial equality. In Brown versus Board of Education, that was ultimately a Supreme Court case. For years and years, the justification, the legal or constitutional justification for segregation was that separate but equal was okay. That the Constitution didn't necessarily say, and the elements of the Bill of Rights didn't necessarily say that you had to be together. Separate but equal was fine. But one of the things that Brown versus Board of Education proved, and one of the premises of that ruling was that the separate wasn't equal. And then there's an assertion that if it's separate, it can never be equal. And so, based on the ruling of the judicial branch of the government, integration was essentially became, a national mandate. And yet, one of the things that's fascinating is that you have, even in that day, a lot of people who claim to be patriots, who claim to love America, who claim to love democracy, who claim to love the rule of law, but were not prepared to support or follow the law when it disagreed with their agenda. Now, here we go again, right? In this presidential election, we've had presidential election that was executed legally, that was executed according to the Constitution, and a transition of power which is supposed to be executed according to the Constitution. And we still have various facets of the government and various citizens who claim to be patriots, claim to love democracy, but when democracy leads them in an area that is contrary to their personal beliefs or their agenda, all of a sudden they're not as embracing of the process of governing. And in this case, there was significant resistance in the area of education, and they put this little girl through hell, really.
Yeah, and if you can think about the mental stress and the mental strain that not only Ruby, but those who were in the neighborhood that would encounter integrating in these schools
Hmm.
after her parents, I just can't imagine um, being her mother, who recently passed away
Hmm.
this year, several weeks ago. By the way, a great woman for the civil rights movement who had great courage. But I can't imagine being her mother, subjecting your child to that type of scrutiny and that type of resistance and hate.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know what that did to her mentally, but our parents were probably watching that whole thing unfold,
Hmm.
right? They were watching that whole thing, having small children, because as I said, we were small. Um, Not at the time that Brown versus Board of Education was passed. Ruby went to, the schools were integrated in 1960. So the Brown versus Board of Education was passed in 1954. It wasn't until 1960, so that does tell you something, that the mandate began and she was the first one to enter. So this ruling sat 6 years before anyone ever really truly integrated. And maybe there were some starts and stops because they just couldn't get there. So what does that let you know? There was some cultural resistance
Hmm.
around the conversation, around the ruling and the decision, and America wasn't quite ready to integrate the schools. With with the resistance being in white America and white suburban America, in white America, and so what America, I'm going to say, we failed to put in risk mitigations.
Yeah, risk mitigations. And what risks are we talking about? We're talking about the risks of Americans who hated black people more than they loved democracy or the rule of law.
Wow, can you say that again?
Americans who hated black people more than they loved democracy or the rule of
Can you
law.
make that current, like present day?
Again, Americans who hated something contrary to their agenda, whether it's the Democratic Party or what the Democratic Party represents, more than they loved democracy or the rule of law. So, yeah, you know,
Who
three
hate black people?
three times, one for the Father, one for the Son, one for the Holy
Oh,
Spirit. But
yeah,
that's a different conversation.
yeah, you said it. So we bring this up to just show that once again, education is in the limelight.
Hmm.
Education has made its way to Joe Biden's Lift Every Voice plan for Black America.
Hmm.
And I'm saying, why in the world, 60 years after, 46 years after Brown versus Board of Education has been, why are we still talking about disparities in education? Why? Because our country is change resistant. In one area where our country is change resistant is what Kwasi just said. When you hate black people more than you value democracy, or you hate to see anything being done for black Americans more than you value democracy. That is a shame,
Yeah,
America.
yeah,
It is a shame.
yeah. And unfortunately, our message will be lost on those who have no shame. But at the end of the day, what has always offered hope is the younger generations. In every generation, there is, a small remnant of people who, you know, love people, who are forward thinking, forward looking, and have conscience. So,
And I think that's where change can grow. That's where change can be cultivated because you have to come with an open mind and have to be willing to address your own personal biases
Mm-hmm.
in order really to see and appreciate the need for change. Um, I don't want to give any plugs, but there have been a lot of literature written on change.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just look at Cotter's book,
Yeah.
many books on change, you will see culturally some examples in American history where we have not been ready for the change that legislation has brought us. Um, and we're going to go into another one which is more of a recent legislation where that change, America also resisted that change. So we want you to be aware and
Mm.
think in terms of the change, acceptance, and resistance, and how America receives, accepts, and embraces change, or rejects change. One of the things I will say in this plan, we brought up Ruby Bridges just to highlight how we have been change resistant. Many of the things that are in this plan, like I think there was some Head Start
Mm-hmm.
programs. These Head Starts programs aren't new.
No.
They've been around. So this plan is in some ways saying things that have already been tried before. Me, I tend to stray away from things we've tried over and over again, and I'm looking for new unicorns, as it were, as my daughter would
New
say.
unicorns, yes.
Right? I'm looking for unicorns and different ways to bring out the best in what already exists, right? So you take a horse, you put a horn on him, you put some, maybe that's a Pegasus with the wings, but you put some pretty colors on him and you got a unicorn.
Hmm.
And what does that do for little girls? That makes them really happy. So I'm looking for ways in which to enhance things that already exist, but to get a better result
Mm-hmm.
out of them. And but they were talking in this plan also about debt, black students or black college debt. Many of us go to college and we have to get student loans because we don't have access to generational wealth. We don't even have access oftentimes to money to pay for college,
Indeed.
let alone wealth, right?
Yeah.
And so it forces many to go on grants and then get loans, and most people work too as well. But when you think about the difference, if I'm going to college, it's fully paid for, my parents have it covered, I can focus solely on school.
Right.
If my parents aren't able or my family isn't able to finance me in that way, then I have other things that I have to be concerned about. I can maybe only dedicate 50% of my thoughts and my processes to school while I have to work and take care of other things.
That really hits home for me personally. I was fortunate enough to get into Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, for undergraduate. I did my aerospace degree there, and my mother, she it took everything she had, even with the financial aid package, to pay for my tuition, and to get me through. And she really didn't have money left over for just my general living expenses, things like food and other things. So I spent my last 3 years at MIT working 25 to 30 hours a week on a job on campus, in addition to my studies. I mean, that was a really heavy lift for me, and I was fortunate that I got out with pretty respectable grades, obviously, and was able to go on and get gainful employment and have a great career. But what else could I have achieved if I could have focused more? Of all my peers, there was nobody else. That I knew of that was working that much on a
Really?
job. Mm-mm.
It was very common at HBCU for
Mm.
people to have jobs, for people to have jobs just to be able to make it, just
Right.
to be able to exist. So it was very common there for us to also have jobs. But what you just said is you didn't know of very many people who were working to the degree that you were on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
So they were allowed to focus mainly on studies. Is
Mm-hmm.
that what I'm hearing you say?
That is what you heard. Yes.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and so the assessment might be that people are certain people with certain privileges are allowed to focus mainly on their studies thereby giving them an advantage.
So let's talk about this next element of Biden's plan for education. Address the African American student debt crisis. And the major bullets here that he's talking about are including in the COVID 19 response immediate cancellation of a minimum of $10,000 of federal student loan debt, forgiving all undergraduate tuition related federal student debt from 2 and 4 year public colleges for debt holders earning up to $125,000. Now, the first question I had when I read that was, is that $125,000 per individual or $125,000 per family? Because if it's the same number for family as it is for the individual, then if you have two spouses together, each of whom have student loan debt, and their combined income is over $125,000, as is very likely in a lot of cases, that might eliminate them from that benefit. Forgiving loan payments for individuals making $25,000 or less per year, capping loan payments at 5% of discretionary income, blah, blah, blah. Fixing public service loan forgiveness program, and forgiving $10,000 of undergraduate student debt for every year of national or community service. And then there are some other provisions. Now, here's the key thing that I want to highlight, and Macretia, you made an allusion to it. You made reference to it earlier, particularly as it pertains to this student debt issue. Now, of course, I know that resonates with a lot of people. Again, even with financial aid, I came out of undergraduate with a degree of student loan debt that would have bought a small house back in 1995 when I got out of undergrad. And it took us many years to pay that debt off. You also had student loan debt, but much less than I did. Um, as it pertains to this, let's think about how this would actually play out. None of this is at the president's discretion alone. In order to implement any of the provisions of this particular part of the plan, it requires legislation, new laws. It requires a commitment for spending portion of the budget on these initiatives. Now, the House of Representatives has what we call the power of the purse when it comes to the architecting of the federal budget. The primary responsibility for that falls with the House of Representatives. They would be the ones to introduce the legislation that would cover these provisions. Now, following the 2020 general election, the House of Representatives is still controlled by the Democratic Party by a slim majority, but is controlled by the Democratic Party, who typically will want to see President Joe Biden's agenda advance because they're all on the same team. But any bill that's introduced has to be approved not only by the House but also by the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And the Senate has been for many years since the midterm elections of President Obama's first term controlled by the Republican Party. And a lot of these provisions, particularly as it's talking about forgiving debt, whenever the Democratic Party or the Democratic legislative bodies want to spend money on anything, the refrain from the Republican Party is, well, how are you going to pay for it? There's no money to pay for this, although they find money to spend on the things that they want to spend it on. My point being that this legislation, when it's drafted, will face very, very strong resistance in the Senate. And particularly if you have a Senate that is committed um, to obstructing the Biden agenda. Let me refer you, and again, before I say this, again, I want to reiterate this because we talked about it before. It may sound otherwise at times, but Macretia and I are not Democrats. Macretia and I are not Republicans. We are really what you would call centrists. We are independents that are a little bit right of center as it pertains to certain things, and we're a little bit left of center as it pertains to other issues. But for the most part, we are centrists, and that means I am an equal opportunity praiser and critic of both the Democratic parties and the Republican parties. And on these particular issues, um, we have a lot to say about just the historic behavior of the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party when we get to the subject of, when we're talking about finances and wealth and we get to the subject of taxes. I'm going to have a whole lot to say about about some of the Democratic Party's initiatives in that area. But right now, we're talking about education, spending money on education, which has not been, particularly for education for Black people, that has not been a major priority of the Republican part of the legislative body. And so you may recall, I'm going to refer you to Mitch McConnell's comments. Um, the day that Barack Obama won the general election 2008, he said the Republican Party's agenda and resources will be aimed at making sure that Barack Obama, our top priority will be making sure that Barack Obama is a one-term president. He didn't say that the top priority would be governing better for America, governing better for all Americans, creating equal opportunity for all Americans to achieve, leveling the playing field. No, no, no. The Republican Party, according to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, the top priority was ensuring that Barack Obama is a one-term president. Since Mitch McConnell is still the leader of the majority, the Republican majority in the Senate, and that type of obstructionist politics, both on the left and on the right, has become the norm. Unfortunately, it's even worse than it's ever been. In Clinton's day or in Ronald Reagan's day. We can expect that a lot of these proposals, a lot of the things that will require congressional action to implement Biden's plan, you can expect significant resistance to a lot of them, if not complete and total obstruction. I hate to be a cynic, and I always want to present a balanced view, but history shows us that although Biden's agenda, his plan, I think addresses a lot of relevant points, things that are important to our community, very little of this has a chance of getting approved.
Yeah, especially if it falls on deaf ears,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think something you said, I mean, in corporate America and government, when we have leadership challenges,
Mm-hmm.
when we're not able to achieve the outcomes in which we plan to have year after year, we often see a leadership shift.
Mm-hmm.
Because America has preserved this leadership construct, America cannot see change until something changes in the leadership. I'm going to say primarily at the Senate level, since it has been this resistance type
Yeah,
of concept that they've been using.
we've had a split Congress. If I recall, the midterm elections in President Obama's first term were in 2010. It was in 2010 that the Democrats lost control of the Senate, and they haven't regained it since. 10 years, and the Republicans have been in control of the Senate. And for 10 years,
We've
you
had
know,
a mess on our hands.
yeah, we had, I guess, for the first, I guess, what was it? For a couple of years, we had a Republican-controlled House, and Paul Ryan was the Speaker.
Hmm.
But the Republicans lost the House, and so I guess for the last I guess really for the last 6 years, the Democrats have held the House. But we have this split Congress. And, with, a Senate that is determined to obstruct most policies, the most progressive policies of a president or, the House of Representatives, and a House that is determined to obstruct the more conservative policies of a president or Senate leaders. That's one of the reasons why Congress gets very little done.
And that all comes back to change. And
Mm-hmm.
that all lets you know that we're very resistant to change. When an organization embraces change, when an organization is about the change, there is a decision at some point to work together to see that change manifest.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing at the highest levels of leadership in this country is it's disappointing, if you ask me. But that I'm now getting into personal
Yeah.
personal opinions, and I wanted to stay away from that. I think you hit on a lot of the things that were
Mm-hmm.
in relationship to the higher level of education. One or two things that we didn't address. Teacher diversity was one of the things.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about Ruby a bit ago. I didn't mention that there was only one teacher in that school, William Frantz Elementary, that would even teach her. Of
Mm-hmm.
all those teachers and students, she couldn't even go to the class, although she made it beyond the doors of that school. She was not in the classroom with
Right.
the white students because the parents threatened to kill her. The parents threatened to remove their children from the institution,
And
from
most of
the
the teachers
school.
refused to teach her.
Yep. And so Barbara Henry was the only teacher, and she was a lady from Boston that agreed to teach Ruby.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that regard, Ruby got one-on-one care and
Yeah.
one-on-one attention, which was good. But mentally, what happened there was not a good thing for America. It was horrible and horrific for Ruby and the rest of Black America, the children who were watching,
Mm-hmm.
and they knew that someday they had to enter a space similar to that. It created some problems
Mm-hmm.
for them as well. And so teacher diversity is one thing. So in that one example, it's important to know that who teaches you can matter,
Yeah.
right? If you're in a classroom and the teacher has already framed that, okay, black children are, they're dumb, I'm not even going to waste my time, then that's not a good environment to be in. And unfortunately, in America, that happens far too much
Yeah.
for people of, definitely black kids. I won't say brown kids because, or yellow kids, because Asian kids, I think, are perceived as being
Smart.
very intelligent. Indian kids are perceived as being very, very intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
But among all the kids, all of the children, and of all of the ethnicities, the only child who was denied the right to learn was the black child
Yeah. Throughout the
in
history of this country.
yeah, of
Nope.
the
Nope.
world.
Yeah. No.
The
No. No
United States
other.
isn't the only country.
Yep. No. No other. No other ethnicity was denied the right to learn, and oh, by the way, the right to earn money and save. Right.
Yeah,
We're
or
gonna
to
get to
bring home a
that.
paycheck.
We're gonna get to
So,
that.
so when we start to unpack a lot of this, don't, you know, there's probably some people who are watching this episode they may feel very uncomfortable.
Mm.
And, a lot of the topics that we're really talking about the unfiltered truth of what happened here, not only in this country, but other countries around the world. It's unfiltered. And some of the things may make you feel angry or make you feel
Mm-hmm.
upset, but it's really important to set the record straight because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of lies have been told.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So let's keep moving through. There's one other point on education I wanted to address, um, and Biden's plan says he wants to increase college completion by making college affordable for African American students. You know, one of the things that has been just absolutely crushing is the rising cost of college education. It's absolutely astronomical, for some of these good universities. Um, but let me go ahead and step into the future here, and as my mentor says, let's lead from the future here for a second. Um, as horrific and as deadly and as world changing as the COVID-19 pandemic is and will be, um, I'm not gonna say that there are good things that are gonna come from it. I would never frame it that way, and I don't view it that way. But when you have an event of this magnitude, um, there are certain things that it will change in how we live and how we do many things in our lives. I think education is one of the things that is being forced to change as a result of the pandemic. We're going to have a generation of students because I think this pandemic, um, in spite of the introduction of the vaccines, for a bunch of reasons that I won't go into right now, I'm not going to bore you with models of viral propagation and herd immunity and all of that stuff. But even with the introduction of vaccines that work, uh, this pandemic, I think, will continue to be extremely deadly for at least another 3 years. Um, and in that case, when you factor in 2020, you're going to have a whole college class, a whole high school class of kids who have had to get their learning online,
Exclusively.
exclusively online. And here's one of the things we're going to see. We're going to see that it has forced us to change our teaching models, because some institutions are going to get the online thing, get that done well. Other institutions will not be as effective in the online thing. But here's the thing. I think what we're going to see is, because we are forced to an online learning model for elementary, for middle, for high school, and for some colleges, with this pandemic lasting for a few years, those institutions that emerge from that doing online education effectively, a lot of kids are going to gravitate to that because there's a lot to love about online learning. And when online learning starts to really take hold and grow and beget and get more accepted, more, done more proficiently, it's going to really be hard to justify paying 50, 60, $70,000 a year, just to walk the halls of a couple 100-year-old campus like a Harvard or something like that,
MIT.
or an MIT for that matter. No disrespect to my Beaver brothers and sisters,
Or
but
Rice.
or Rice. You all notice I'm repping the Rice Owls today. Much love to the class of 2020 Rice Business School. But it's going to be really hard for those institutions to justify charging that level of tuition for an environment where you're not going to have a lot of people there anyway, compared to years past. And I think one of the things that will occur as a result of the pandemic is a shift in that educational model, which hopefully will make access to quality education easier for people of color.
Yeah, and I think this would be a subject for another day. I've had my bout with the educational system, even though we've had our children in private schools. The curriculum. We're going to see a lot of curriculum shift as we move forward, to realign and to filter some of the mistruths that have propagated. But these things have been here year for year after year after year. It's
Yeah.
not in Biden's plan, but I do think that for black and brown children to have a chance, there needs to be a change in some of the curriculum development.
And before we move forward, I want to address something because I'm sensing in my spirit. There's some people who might be watching us. When you said we've had our kids in private school, just to sort of clear the air on that, because there's some people that feel one kind of way or another about it. I myself spent most of my education in private schools. Not all of it. I was in public school for a season. You, I think, spent most of your elementary, and in fact, all of your elementary and middle and high school education in public school. And our children, although they have spent most of their time in private schools, sometime in public schools, we are not of the camp that believes private school is inherently better than public school, or public school is inherently inferior to private school. There are some people that believe that. We're not of the camp that believe that. Our decisions were based on evaluating the particular disposition and needs of our children and what was available in that area at the time. In those instances, sometimes we made the decision to put our kids in a public school, and there are instances where we've made the decision to put our kids in private school. Our kids are in public school right now.
Yeah, because that's the only, I think, effective online option that we have. But in times past, we have chosen private over public.
Yeah.
Okay, moving right along. So anything else we need to talk about in education?
I think we can move forward to the next major
Okay,
part of the
and
Biden's
there was
plan.
a good segue to health. I believe
Yeah,
the
healthcare.
healthcare is the next one.
Yeah. Or no. Yeah. So healthcare. Yes.
Healthcare, and so the interesting thing about it, this particular topic needs no introduction. With the onset of COVID-19 and everything we're seeing in the media, everything we're seeing play out with the virus, we are seeing a lot of issues being highlighted. We're seeing also some great ideas and great things come from our scientific community too as well. But the Biden plan addresses health disparities. And what is one of the first bullets that is there that was quite shocking? Public option for healthcare.
Yeah, as part of the response to the pandemic, creating a public option to make healthcare more affordable. Now, what's fascinating about this is, you may all remember that, when the Affordable Health Care Act was drafted and passed in the Obama administration, the Affordable Health Care, affectionately and pejoratively referred to as Obamacare. Um, One of the biggest bones of contention was the so-called public option. That is, where the government pays for, healthcare, and people have an opportunity for the government to pretty much exclusively pay for healthcare, not so much providing subsidized health insurance, but to pay for healthcare. That's what they mean by public option. And in this country, a public option, there's a narrative that associates a so-called public option with what you may have referred to as socialized medicine. That is medicine, that is under sort of a socialist government or socialist system. And then there is also a narrative that is associated socialized medicine with inferior medicine. You can look at healthcare systems around the world, and we're not going to go into that too deeply now. But if you look at healthcare systems around the world, and you go to websites like the World Health Organization, or you just do a Google search on top countries for healthcare, something of that sort, one of the things you'll notice is that the United States is not ranked number one. And when they look at healthcare, they're looking at various attributes of healthcare. Number one, the healthcare technology, what types of medicine and what types of sort of technology and health practices is present, sort of the state of the art there, quality of hospitals, but also two key factors are the affordability of healthcare and access to healthcare as a
Which
percentage
it
of the
would be the
population.
percentage of insured
Right.
of the population. When you look across the percentage of insured, United States ranks lower than many of the other Western world countries.
Yes.
While we may rank higher in the area of technology
Mm-hmm.
advancement, in things like percent insured or the number of doctors to population and the number of nurses to population, we rank lower.
Yeah, and really, if you look at this data, and again, I'm not giving a plug for socialism, because socialism historically has also been linked with certain governments that had different ideologies and different way of governing than what we believe in here in the United States. So I'm not talking about socialism, but if you look at these rankings worldwide, the United States. Is ranked far below in the World Health Organization's aggregate assessment of healthcare in the United States. We rank in the 30s behind countries like France, Canada, Germany, many European countries, um, and
Japan even and
Japan,
Taiwan.
and
I mean,
Taiwan.
you have to go look it up for yourself. So when we go back to change,
Yeah,
that we talked about before, when you're voting and when you're considering what's on the ticket and what we desperately need change in the area of healthcare.
yeah.
Our cost performance in healthcare is way higher.
Than most countries. In fact, as far as our cost, the cost per capita, I think we have one of the highest, if not the highest, cost
We have the highest cost,
in
and
the
it's
world.
sometimes by a factor of two, and could be a factor of three by the lowest.
But yet, and because this is the argument, some people, we don't necessarily have the best outcomes. The life expectancy in the United States is the average life expectancy is less than several other countries by 5, in some cases 10 years. So we've got this exorbitant cost, but not necessarily the best outcomes. Now, obviously, our healthcare is better than what a lot of people think, in lesser developed countries.
But these are people who've not even read a book. These are
Right.
people who've not even looked at a statistic.
Yeah.
So it's important for you to be
Woke.
aware, woke about these things, and stop speaking out of what you feel. Go get the data.
Go get the data. Go get the data. Absolutely. This is why you need a coach. This is why we're here.
Go look at the data. But when you look at it, I think in life expectancy, when you look at maybe the top 10 on life expectancy, we're 10.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, nine, I think, yeah, but we don't rank the highest even in top 10 of life expectancy. So bottom line is our healthcare system, as we've seen in COVID, has a lot of vulnerabilities. Not that
Hmm.
others don't, but we're vulnerable in a lot of areas. We don't have a plan. We
Right.
don't have to have a plan to get, and one of the things we're fighting some of the key things that could help us improve.
Yeah.
Right? We can improve our numbers if people don't die of asthma.
That's
But
right.
because people don't have access to health care, children are dying of asthma.
Yeah.
You
And
can improve your numbers right there, giving them access to the meds and to the doctors that they need for the care.
absolutely. And let's tie this again. Let's bring this back to wealth, because we're not just here pontificating and commentating about the social injustices. This is all about understanding the playing field, understanding the rules of the game, and thinking about it in context. Because in the coming episodes, we're going to bring this back to money and show you how to win this game, even with the current rules. But the COVID-19 crisis and the disparity in healthcare has a direct impact on wealth. Healthcare is probably, I think, one of the top, if not the top, expense on average
It
for
equates to about 17% of a household,
yeah,
if you have
for
any.
American families. 17% spent on healthcare alone. Now, when you have an ethnicity of people like black people who already verifiably, statistically verifiably, have a significant wealth and income gap from other ethnicities, and then we're also shelling out all this money on healthcare and don't even necessarily have access. It's hard to be wealthy if you aren't healthy. You can't be wealthy if you're not
That's
healthy,
fair.
right? And also COVID-19, this isn't necessarily directly associated with healthcare, but it's about the pandemic. COVID-19 is having a crushing effect economically. There are whole businesses that simply cannot operate. Brick and mortar businesses that employ lots of black people that cannot operate. There are a lot of black people, a disproportionately higher number of black people unemployed or unable to earn a living as a result of the economic impact of the pandemic versus many other ethnicities. And that's not to say that, everyone isn't suffering, right? Because I want to be very, very clear. This is not a message against anyone. We are talking about challenges that are unique to black people, or challenges maybe not unique, but that are exacerbated
Yeah,
in the black
by
community
lower incomes.
by lower
Yeah.
incomes. Yeah.
And I think, and that's why it ends up here on the plan for Black America.
All
And I
right.
think the issue of access is probably one of the
That's the biggest one.
greater issues there. So healthcare, but being willing to really look at where we are, assess who you are. When we look at athletes and we start ranking athletes or team performance, and we don't shy away from the fact that there are top teams and lower teams.
Hmm.
And what we're simply saying to you today is we're not in the top 10.
No, we're not.
That's what we're telling you.
Yeah.
We're not winning in the area of healthcare.
So just to be clear, we grow up thinking and being taught and, understandably believing that America, the United States, is the best at everything. We're the best country in the world. We're the best at this. We're the best at that. And we are the best at many, many things. It's one of the reasons why so many people from around the world are attracted to the United States of America. But when it comes to healthcare, the data is very clear. We are not the best. And, countries that are the best include some of these provisions in their healthcare system that many of our politicians, rail against and label as socialized medicine. And that's just something for us to think about. And something, and the key thing for you players is to be aware and keep an ear out and an eye out for these discussions and these debates in the coming months and coming years of President Biden's administration.
Yeah, because I think there's a big difference in healthcare played out of the operational or performance aspects of healthcare versus research aspects.
Hmm.
Research wise, I do think that we are, from a technological perspective, research wise, I do think that, and the data shows that the United States is still a top player
Yeah.
there, if not the, you know, most, the the biggest contributor of medical research
Yeah.
in the world. But what what good does it do for us to be such a huge contributor in medical research if we can't execute it?
If we don't, if our people don't have access to it.
Yeah. All right. So that's healthcare, everyone.
So next is strengthening America's commitment to justice.
Yep.
That's the next major point. And really, the core elements of this are, dealing with disparities when it comes to the number of people incarcerated as a whole, the disproportionate number of those people that are black, and basically rooting out inequities in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, one thing I will say about this, there's a movie that's out there, and it just shows a glimpse of what happened in the 1990s as it relates to the drug situation. But it's called 13th. It was on Netflix. It's an Ava DuVernay show. It's really good. I think it may have been produced by Oprah Winfrey's network, but it's a really good show. I would encourage everyone to go watch it. Also on the justice front, this has been a year where justice, we have seen things hanging in the balance with respect to justice from the beginning of this year to the very end of this year as we approach 2021. I don't think the justice scales are going to leave the table. They're going to continue in 2021 and beyond to be a significant thing for us to watch. Even after George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, which were the three people that were killed around the same amount of time, like within a short period of time. After all those deaths, we're still continuing to see deaths of Black Americans across this country as it relates to cops or also as it relates to hate crimes.
Yeah.
So with that, we are still fighting the good fight in the social justice front. For those of you who are out there marching and who are doing what you can in terms of crying out, that is great. I do think that there needs to be a movement beyond the protest, right? What's next beyond the protest? And we do have this Biden plan for Black America, and we have to then begin to translate. What does that translate in my community? What does that translate in my world? What can I do? And so we look forward to having more conversations around the justice topic. There's just so much to unpack there.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things too, to be aware of, and this is sort of an area where I always want to give some emphasis, on the subject of education disparities. Too many of our people don't really understand how the government works. They either haven't been taught, haven't been interested, haven't necessarily known where to get the information. But as it pertains to the justice system, there's a couple of things to note. When it comes to judges at the city level, at the county level, at the state level, at the federal level, for the most part, judges come in two flavors. They are either elected, just like legislators or governors or presidents, senators, representatives are elected, or they are appointed. When they are appointed, those appointments are typically lifetime appointments. And so when it comes to the elected judges, and this is mostly at the state and local level, I have always encouraged you players to pay attention to the whole ballot. Racial justice in the justice system starts at the ballot box because the people who appoint the judges are typically in the executive branch and they are elected, and the people who are elected judges are also elected. Know who's on the ballot, know who's running, do some research on their background, their reputation, what political party they're part of. Because at the end of the day, the laws are often ambiguous because as languages of the earth go, although we all love the English language because it's our language, the English language is one of the more ambiguous and less precise languages in terms of our vocabulary and syntax. And so our laws are often subject to interpretation. Well, what happens with that interpretation? Prosecutors who work for the sort of the executive, the uh, the uh, the executive branch of that government. You know, the district attorney, state prosecutor, attorney general, etc. They decide what cases to pursue. The juries decide guilt or innocence based on the fact pattern and based on instructions that are presented to them, based on charges that are presented to them by the prosecutor. And prosecutors are often appointed or elected. District attorneys are often elected. Um, and then the judges determine the sentencing. Okay? So a lot of this disparity between, blacks and whites in terms of number of people in jail that comes from prosecutors making the decision to prosecute blacks for a certain crime more than they prosecute whites for similar offenses or with a similar fact pattern, and for juries out of a collective social bias tending to find black people guilty or believing black people guilty than others because of cultural bias, and judges with their bias assigning harsher sentences to blacks versus whites. The other thing that occurred in the 90s, and this speaks to what you alluded to earlier, Macretia, about the war on drugs in the 90s. A lot of the policies that got put in place with mandatory minimum sentences, which took the discretion away from the judges for certain crimes. There are a lot of people in jail right now due to mandatory minimum sentences that are really receiving, harsher punishment than is probably justified.
Yeah, and that's the difference between the crack cocaine and cocaine.
Right.
Fundamentally, they're the same thing,
Yes.
but the sentencing is different. And Joe Biden was behind a lot of that.
Yes.
And so I think this,
And Clinton.
yeah, and this will be an opportunity for him to come and correct some of the
Make some of
things.
that right.
And he's talked about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's talked about not knowing
Mm-hmm.
how far it would go and how who it would impact, because that was never really a part of that conversation. They were just so enthused about addressing the drug issue that they really didn't look at the social aspect of it. And it ended up being a travesty for many black Americans and Hispanic Americans too as well. One other thing I will say about it, since you really talked about justice, I will say one of the things that, and if you follow me on Facebook or any of my social media, you'll know that one of the things I have looked into and I've spoken very loudly about is the Karen effect.
Mm.
And it's something I'm pretty passionate about.
It's a
because
real thing.
It happens far too often. And you can look at FBI statistics, you can look at police statistics in cases where white women lie. They accuse black people of doing things they never did. They fabricate a story and call the police, and a black person is behind bars.
Right.
That's all I'm going to say about that. But that leads to the fear mongering. That leads to how their children respond. That leads to a culture of fear when you're looking at a black person. You drive up, you park your car, you get out of your car to walk your dog, and all of a sudden the police are behind you because you intended to do something wrong.
Yeah, and so during this next administration, this is an area, of course, which we're really passionate about, because we have we're the parents of a black boy,
You're a black man.
and I'm a black man, by the way, and so we're going to be on the lookout for discussion of this, and this is not just a federal issue, right? A lot of times these the laws associated with it and how the laws are enforced, carried out. Policing happens at the city level. Day-to-day policing doesn't happen at the federal level, and so this is where state and local politicians and officers, again, you're going to hear me say this, players, all the time, because one of the things I am very, very passionate about is politics. I don't know a whole lot about football. I know virtually nothing about basketball. I think the sport I'm most interested in is baseball, but I don't know a ton about that. But one thing I do know very well is politics. Many sheriffs, your county law enforcement officials, many of them are elected. Justice starts, or I should say, pivots from the ballot box. You need to pay attention to more than just the presidential election every 4 years.
And you don't know, not only do you need to pay attention, you need to start organizing in your
Yes.
communities on how you can get on the ballot.
And how you can get involved. I
Who's
mean,
popular in your area that would be a good judge, that fits the criteria of what a judge is, that fits
Yeah.
the criteria of what some of these appointed positions are. Identify some non-biased candidates for these particular positions and get on the tickets.
yeah. In fact, if we recall, we were active participants in our city's local election process during the 2008 general election, during the primary season. We went out and we were part of the caucus that occurred, and we actually offered ourselves up as electors. They selected other people as electors from our district to go to state, but we were actively involved. Um, and these operations, these things occurred. They didn't occur during business hours. They occurred after hours. We realized that a lot of people are not able to get involved in certain things because they just can't manage their work schedules and that sort of things. We realize we're very privileged in that regard with having more what you call white collar jobs. But like I said,
I think you made it to the state.
yeah, actually I did. I did. That's true. I made it to state. But the thing is, if you got time to memorize the stats of your favorite football quarterback, you got time to research who's on the ballot and to make sure you know when every local election is occurring, when every city election is occurring, when every county election is occurring, and to go down and participate because it's in those elections. If you God forbid, get charged with, some kind of misdemeanor or felony, you know, is if it's not a federal crime, you will be going before a judge that was elected in the county where the crime occurred.
And we know that there's a such thing for just being black.
Yeah.
As a crime, people say, I really don't know what this crime was. I didn't commit this crime, but for some reason, I have been accused of this crime. So we call that the JBB, right? And when people are accused of something just because they were black.
Yep.
And we know that that is a thing here in America. And I didn't mean to open up a can of worms. But getting on the ballot, knowing who's on the ballot and about them is not enough. Getting on the ballot, making sure that you support people who would be non-biased. But it's also important in your community. Some of you have a lot of opportunity to influence your communities. And you should be taking advantage of that, especially those of you who are in very small communities where there are large minority populations or non-biased type populations. Don't allow people on the ballot just because they were the only ones that ran to win the elections.
Yeah, and here's one other thing I'm going to say about this because we're going to talk about this in a great deal of detail. But I wanted to give the players a primer. Understanding certain elements of the law is important, particularly as it pertains to wealth. There are two, very famous black stars. One of them, I'm not going to call their names out, but you can look at this. Many of you probably know. One of them was one of our most famous black actors. One of them was, one of our more famous up and coming black rappers and athletes who had fortunes, who lost everything because they went to jail behind tax matters. Okay, so you watch us. We're gonna teach you how to use techniques to build wealth. We're going to teach you. But you got to play by the rules of the game. And this is what this, like I said, we're not just pontificating about politics, although I could talk politics all day long.
Yeah, it's the way we started out because of this Biden agenda and
Mm-hmm.
the change of administration. So just bear with us over the next couple of
Couple of weeks.
yeah,
Hmm.
we'll get to some other good content.
Yeah, we're going to talk. We're going to start talking money next week. We've been
All
laying a
right.
foundation. So let's bring it home. Last thing in this Biden plan, won't talk about it too much, is address environmental justice. Now, what's that about?
Well, when I first looked at it, I went, well, how does this apply to Black America? How does this even, but when I started to read into it a little bit deeper, in our inner cities, we're running freeways, we're dumping waste, we're not cleaning, we're moving things out of the inner city so they're not getting the attention that they once did. And so environmentally, there are some areas in the inner cities that are polluted. We do have children that live in those areas, of course, adults as well. But the rise of the respiratory disorders is a very direct correlation to what's happening in the inner cities. And so, with that said, I do think that the environmental aspect, there's probably a small percentage of the environmental aspect of what is in his plan that directly affects Black America. I don't know that it is one of our big issues, but it is in here. I'm going to call it pork. Pork on the bill. It's an add-in, but it does have a bit of correlation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that sort of wraps it up. Just to kind of summarize and give you the key takeaways. Again, this is not intended to be just a rant about politics. This is about getting you conscious of, aware of, and interested in the rules of the game. We have a new president coming in. We've got many new congressmen coming in, not just at the national level, but at the state and local level. These are the people that make and carry out the rules. These are, the judges are the referees. The lawmakers, they make the playbook. We're going to starting next week to talk in great deal about money for the next several weeks, several episodes. We're going to start to get into part of what we came here for, which is to teach you how to build wealth, how to build it for yourself, how to build it for your children and your children's children. But this whole game is played on a foundation of rules with adjudicators, referees, coaches, judges, owners, and fans, as well as detractors. And so think about the things we've talked about. Look for those things. Look for discussion of those things in the news. Look at what's being discussed that concerns you by Biden, by the Congress. Look at what's not being discussed that concerns you. And think about these things as we move into techniques for how to build wealth, because these laws will affect what options you have available to you and what it's going to cost you. And so, with that, we are very much grateful for your attention. Don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe, click that notification bell so you get notified of new episodes, and share this video. We are not doing this for money. We're doing this to give back, on our journey. And so we want you to share. It's not about our monetization or anything like that. We make money through other means. We just want to be a blessing to our people. And so with that, we'll see you next time, players. And remember, our message is relevant.
Our message is woke.
And our message will absolutely empower our people to prosper. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.